I'll be listening to the black scene, asking every question like it's a vaccine.
What do you know about Canada? Is it the loving, gentle, never regressive image we've all been presented with? Do you think of the famous cartoon Canadian Mountie, Dudley Do-Right? What if I told you all of that is a bold-faced lie? You ever notice propaganda about melanated, peaceful people always positions them as having naturally violent and criminal behavior, but propaganda about violent white people always portrays white people as dopey or innocent? What if we told you the Canadian Police, or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, are one of the most aggressive and violent anti-First Nations, state-backed white supremacist organizations in the world? What if we told you that they've always been this way, have no plan to get better, and in fact, have a plan to get worse? I'm your host, Allo, and this is Anti-Racist News. From here, we need to stop and issue a trigger warning. From this point, we're going to talk about colonization and policing against Indigenous First Nation people. For many people, this is still a living reality and has been ongoing for hundreds of years. This is genocide. Please be kind to your heart. By the 1800s, 90 to 99% of the 100 million Indigenous First Nation peoples in Canada were murdered. Despite all of the misleading information about Canadian colonization being much less violent than the US, as if comparing two murderous groups is ever going to end in a reasonable conclusion, even thinkers of the time thought the Indigenous people were marching toward extinction. Marching? Are you serious? Are we talking about people being murdered to the level of genocide, as if they wanted to be on this path? We're fantasizing this now, and in that desire, they're marching to their own self-determined destruction? No. First Nations people were hunted and murdered. Let's be very clear. White colonizers decided to prepare the land by forcibly removing the surviving Indigenous people after destroying all of the Indigenous people's natural food supplies, to include the unnecessary, inhumane, and brutal slaughter of the bison. The Canadian government only promised food security if Indigenous people moved to pre-selected reservations. On these reservations, the starvation and suffering of Indigenous people was both made worse and hidden further. The white supremacist Canadian government realized they could control the narrative and disinformation around Indigenous people in order to keep the general population unaware of the ongoing genocide. White colonizers used disease and starvation, just like here in the US, to murder people they recently relied on to survive. This type of hatred doesn't just go away. In comes residential schools. These state-backed religious institutions were designed expressly to tear apart Indigenous children from their families, languages, and cultures. Let me say that another way. White Christian Catholic residential schools forced Indigenous First Nations people under threat of pain or death to give up their own culture in favor of learning how to be white. Not European or French or British, white. Race-based hatred, ethnic cleansing, cultural discrimination, genocide. All while white people culturally appropriate Indigenous people. The same white people that won't go stand with the people whose culture they're actively appropriating while those people are being murdered. We are looking Indigenous people in the eyes and saying, as long as I'm here when you get murdered, someone will be here to replace you. This is not okay. Don't think so? Of the 150,000 children who were torn from their homes and shipped into these internment camps, more than 6,000 children have been discovered dead, murdered so far. In mass graves, no recognition of the loss of human life, no accountability, just impatience from the Canadian government. Impatience from the Canadian government, who has all of the authority to hold people to account. But not one person has been held to account to this day. The people who made the decisions, the people who have covered it up, the people who murdered the children, most of them are still alive to this day, living full lives, perfectly happy. And the Canadian government is impatient with Indigenous people who are still waiting on justice. So how does all of this happen? Does the population of white people being collectively taxed to fund this genocide know about the genocide? If they do they know who the target of the genocide is? If they do, why don't they care? RCMP began as the Northwest Mounted Police with the clear intention to establish, uphold, and maintain a white supremacist government on the lands of Indigenous First Nation people, keeping in mind that minimal bloodshed includes starvation and biological warfare where people die quietly. They forced Indigenous people into death traps and prevented them from leaving. Despite making up just 5% of Canada's population, Indigenous people make up 30% of the prison population, rising to 54% in areas with higher Indigenous populations. Further, Indigenous people are 10 times more likely than white people to get shot and murdered by a member of the RCMP. This is more state-backed violence, who happens to look a lot like US police do. I wonder if there's a trend on policing. Turns out, this is who the RCMP are. Their toxic history didn't go anywhere because the agency never changed. It even attacks its own members. Therefore, no one outside of its organization is safe. Take it from Alice Clark, the RCMP's first woman Mountie. Now, you would assume that RCMP cares to be inclusive in order to legitimize their agency. Fortunately, those who practice hate also practice fear, and a woman who can do what men can do terrifies hateful men. In September 1981, RCMP began its harassment and victimization campaign against Clark and all women who would dare try to be one of the boys. They left plastic breasts on her desk, refused to use her name, told her to go home, suggested women are only useful for having babies, told her she was a waste of a uniform. While on duty guarding a dead body, another male RCMP agent sexually harassed Clark. RCMP obviously has no statement. And what would their statement be? Women know the truth? The amount of women who know exactly what this one woman went through is astounding. This is what I was talking about in another video. White people force others into their personal internal narratives of who they are so we can't be seen as frauds, beginning with white male patriarchy. In 1997, the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en First Peoples Nation took the argument that their land was unceded and belonged to them to Canada's Supreme Court, and won. Further, this ruling recognized the hereditary chiefs as an official governing body. With these two precedents established, Canada now has to figure out its legal positioning against the Wet'suwet'en people. Right now, it's trying to give access to the land to oil companies, greedy, destructive oil companies, and it has no right to do so. Even during colonization, laws established that Indigenous First Nations people had a right to the land they already existed on. After all, they'd been here for at least 15,000 years compared to the 160 years of white colonizer governments and violence. To this day, the Wet'suwet'en people have not been conquered. The UN issued the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, which was adopted by the Canadian government in 2016. Despite all of that, let's take a look at what Trudeau, Prime Minister to Canada, has to say. Okay, Canada recognizes, have faced and continue to face around. Hold up. What do you mean have faced in Canada and continue to face around the world? Why not continue to face in Canada and throughout the world? The Canadian Prime Minister, everyone, erasing their own present day actions. Now you have to wonder what working to right persisting historic wrongs actually means. And without missing a breath, we're told what it means. Despite recognizing the Declaration of Rights, the Canadian Prime Minister is calling the situation unacceptable and untenable. He suggests that the Canadian people have been patient in waiting for the Wet'suwet'en people to give up their rights to their land. And that's where we are right now. Oil companies, led by Exxon, demand to bypass the 1997 Supreme Court ruling as well as the Declaration of Indigenous Rights. How do they plan on doing this? The same way every other white supremacist government attacks Indigenous people, with its police breaking the law, being criminals. In January of 2019, Royal Canadian Mounted Police's Aboriginal Police Liaison informed Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs that they would be conducting military-style raids on their land. Can we talk about that for a second? The hyper level of racism that exists, creating a police force specifically identified for the Indigenous people. There are no white-only police forces. I want that to be clear. And the land is still unceded. Nothing has changed since the 1997 Supreme Court ruling. No facts are missing here, yet the Canadian government's answer is still violence. All of this for corporate interest, to allow TransCanada, a bullshit name that just means we want to spill oil all over the land and ruin the natural water tables, to use treaty warfare against Indigenous people in order to enact violence. Again. And there's a long history of RCMP breaking the law to violate Indigenous rights. They even abducted a journalist and their cameraman in order to cover up their actions and ensure no one can witness the illegal behaviors. Dear Canadians, how do you feel safe with that organization running around? They have no limitations on when they can violate the laws that justify them being violent. They are literally above the law. Just like here in the US. Are y'all trying to compete with us? You're supposed to make us rise to your level, not fall to your level. Canada doesn't really come off as the innocent neighbor in the North when you learn about its real history, does it? Worse, you learn how efficient white supremacy is at hiding its disinformation and murder of its victims while claiming they're innocent. Governmental level Darvo. And that's the primary element of white supremacist organizational disinformation. It's to deny, attack, and reverse victim order. This is the most efficient function of any white capitalist government in this world, with Canada and US literally leading the way in hiding our crimes against humanity. And that's what RCMP and the Canadian government are doing here, projecting criminality onto the Wet'suwet'en people and all Indigenous people. We create laws that turn people into criminals. We deny access to legal remedies to non-corporate entities. We are authoritarian, fascist nations. Dear people of Canada, has it been too long? Are you the ones impatient with the Wet'suwet'en people? Or is your government just using you as a shield, another action made by abusers, in order to deflect their responsibility to accountability here? Do you feel comfortable with your government making you out to be accepting of these violations of Indigenous rights? Do you not feel uncomfortable with your government making you out to be okay with violations of law and order? After violent colonization, after being forced onto specific plots of land, after stealing and murdering their children, after being given sovereignty by the Supreme Court, Wet'suwet'en people are still facing hate by the Canadian government. Go defend them. They've been defending you. Hell, they've been defending all of us.
Booster injected, I'm ready to learn me something. Same skin, think fast, doesn't equal same team.